In the words of Bobby Hill, this flower is wilting. It is so hot. Gone with the Wind has been at times the second best-selling book after the Bible. It's also considered one of the most beloved pieces of American literature ever written, which is concerning. The film adaptation starring Vivian Leigh is also the highest grossing film of all time, adjusted for inflation, even now, and features a performance by Hattie McDaniel that made her the first actor of African descent to ever win an Oscar. Yet the film and the book have such a mixed legacy when it comes to the depiction of enslaved and free Black people. When it comes to the legacy of the film versus the book, I feel there are differences, but I'm not going to get into the film. If you want to see one of my favorite takes on Gone with the Wind, you can watch Cold Crash Pictures' video on Gone with the Wind. I thought it was very fair and balanced to the film, its legacy, and is a really good two-parter on the topic. Personally, I have only seen the movie once. It's very long. Beautiful gowns, great acting, but too long. Jezebel tells the same story in an hour and change, so if I'm gonna watch a racist, movie, I'll just watch it in that length. I am concerned with the book, and more importantly asking, what does Gone with the Wind have to offer Black readership? Nothing. It's a huge part of American literary canon, and it is frequently brought up in conversations about banned books because of the allegations of racism. And of course, as many of you will know, since the initial writing of this script, the movie was taken down and put back on to HBO Max, which reignited the should it be banned conversation. So I want to take a look at the book, its writer, and its literary impact and ask the question, do Black people need to read Gone with the Wind? And when we say that we don't want to, should white people ask us, have you given it a chance yet?
Men may flirt with girls like that, but they don't marry them. I think you're being very mean to them.
A lot of times books get labeled as racist just because they authentically, and sometimes too eagerly, depict the racism that was true to the time period. For example, I personally don't think Huckleberry Finn is racist. I mean, at the core of the story is about helping a Black man escape slavery. It just uses the hard R too liberally, and that is problematic and can make it really uncomfortable to read, especially when you are the only Black kid in a mostly white classroom, because then you're just having your white classmates say the hard R to you and saying, well, it's in the book, teacher, and nothing happens. But that is more about how we teach these texts than the actual content of the book. In Gone with the Wind, slavery is really just a backdrop for the story. The lives of enslaved Black people and later newly freed Black people is largely inconsequential to what the book is trying to say. And basically it's just not very important to Miss Margaret Peggy Mitchell. Gone with the Wind to a degree can be considered kind of a post-anti-Tom fiction. Anti-Tom fiction are books about the antebellum period of American history that were written to counter the brutality depicted in Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. We will get to that book later. Anti-Tom fictions are pro-slavery books in which enslaved people are part of the family. They just really love their white masters and are unable to exist without the good white folk that help take care of them. Slavery is a mercy to them. While Gone with the Wind is not explicitly this, because the pro-slavery narrative explicitly in that incarnation died after the Civil War, you can see how the book does feed into those mentalities, especially because it frames the racial conflict as jealousy between poor white folk and slaves. Because the poor white folk are jealous of the slaves for being provided for by their generous masters. There was frank contempt in Jim's voice. His own social status was assured because the Tarletons owned 100 Negroes, and, like all slaves of large planters, he looked down on small farmers whose slaves were few. It's a very, Kanye take on the situation there, Jims. In contrast, let's get the white perspective. Slattery hated his neighbors with what little energy he possessed, sensing their contempt beneath their courtesy, and especially did he hate rich folks' uppity. The house Negroes of the county considered themselves superior to white trash, and their unconcealed scorn stung him, while their more secure position in life stirred his envy. By contrast with his own miserable existence, they were well fed, well clothed, and looked after in sickness and old age. They were proud of the good names of their owners, and, for the most part, proud to belong to people who were quality, while he was despised by all. Cool, just super normal racial commentary that pits poor and enslaved people against each other. You love to see it. Can you just imagine just longingly just being like, man, I wish that I was owned by a person. And yes, I know this is part of the course for a lot of text and a lot of the sentiment, but this is done without any sort of understanding that it's wrong. We are constantly told how Mammy secretly runs the family in Gone with the Wind, and how Gerald O'Hara, the patriarch, and Scarlett's beloved papa, just can't stand to be mean to the slaves, because they are like children or animals to him. Beneath his choleric exterior, Gerald O'Hara had the tenderest of hearts. He could not bear to see a slave pouting under a reprimand, no matter how well deserved, or hear a kitten mewing or a child crying, but he had a horror of having this weakness discovered. Yes, because if they knew that he was soft and gentle, they would just all take advantage of the poor massa. Mammy felt she owned the O'Haras, body and soul, that their secrets were her secrets, and even a hint of mystery was enough to set her upon the trail as relentlessly as a bloodhound. So she felt she owned them body and soul, even though legally they are the ones who do own her body and soul.
Come on in the house. Come on in before you catch your death of dampness.
No, I'm going to wait for Pa to come home from the Wilkses.
Come on in here. Come on.
What is also really interesting about the book is how it connects to themes of Irish land ownership through Scarlett's father, Gerald, who is an immigrant from Ireland. He represents this idealized, almost mystical Irish independence throughout the book. Gerald wanted to be a slave owner and a landed gentleman, with the deep hunger of an Irishman who had been a tenant on the lands his people once had owned and hunted. He wanted to see his own acres stretching green before his eyes. With a ruthless singleness of purpose, he desired his own house, his own plantation, his own horse, his own slaves. Tara in the book, The Plantation, is named after the seat of the High Kings of Ireland, referenced in the harp that runs through Tara's halls. In fact, throughout the story, Scarlett and the O'Hara's Irishness other them in their own community. Rhett even calls Scarlett's father a, quote, smart Mick on the make at one point because he's an asshole. Scarlett's father gets nearly a whole half of a chapter about his backstory as a poor Irishman who built himself up from nothing, quote unquote. What's even worse is that the book actively brings up the fact that the British kept the Irish from land ownership and social mobility, while the O'Haras gained all of that via slave labor. Yet, the narrative will say in one page it was built by slave labor, and then go on to say that he, meaning Gerald, had done it all. Little, hard-headed, blustering Gerald.
You tell me, Katie Scarlett O'Hara, that Tara, that land doesn't mean anything to you? Why, land is the only thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. Because it's the only thing that lasts.
Oh, Paul, you talk like an Irishman.
It's proud I am that I'm Irish. And don't you be forgetting, Missy, that you're half Irish too. And to anyone with a drop of Irish blood in them, why, the land they live on is like their mother.
One of the things that was interesting I discovered while I was researching this lovely video you're watching right now was that Frederick Douglass actually traveled to Ireland, and his anti-slavery message was actually quite well received there. And then he would return to America. People who proudly called themselves Irish Americans dismiss him. Quite funny to me because it reminded me of the sort of unity that existed between the IRA and the Black Panthers during the 60s and 70s that never translated to any sort of unity between Black Americans and Irish Americans. If anything, this just speaks to how America is so uniquely anti-Black in its construction that it can have people from other oppressed, marginalized places who can be oppressed in America as well, but still align themselves with whiteness and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Despite the fact that we know that there were signs that would say, no Blacks, no dogs, no Irish, you could go from Irishman to Georgian slave owner, like the O'Hara patriarch. The Irish were in competition with African Americans for housing, employment, and the tolerance of their neighbors. They knew that every advantage lay in identifying with the white race and readily joined the oppressor class. It is a sad reminder of how poor white people and even other immigrants are systematically taught that they should align themselves with whiteness and spurn Black Americans, even when it goes against their own class interest. To briefly, and I mean briefly, touch on the film, a lot of the changes to characters like Mammy were done by David O. Selznick, who did, to his credit, want to make sure that the Negroes were happy-ish. He did remove a lot of the Klan references because at the time the Klan was rising in numbers and he didn't want to create another film that was aligned with their ideology. Again, if you want more, the Cold Crash Pictures video I recommended earlier does go more into sort of like what Selznick did and didn't do. Still, it is important to note that many of the Black actors who were hired did so because they needed a paycheck. It was a very, very hard environment as a Black actor, and some of them were deeply uncomfortable with the script's racial slurs. The use of the N-word disturbed a lot of the people who were auditioning for roles, and Butterfly McQueen was warned that her complaining about racially segregated bathrooms could possibly get her blacklisted. Mr. Selznick would never give me another job, she was warned. Whatever visual representation you can argue for these actors is fundamentally problematic. McQueen never seriously worked again. McDaniel, despite winning an Oscar, never saw her career take off from it or evolve past the Mammy roles that she had already been working to humanize more in the earlier parts of her career. So even that golden Oscar is not even a win for McDaniels in terms of what she was allowed to do with her success. In fact, Black actors and actresses would use roles like Mammy as an example of the types of work they didn't want to do. She ended up getting more backlash for playing these roles than she got praise for winning an Oscar. Personally, the thing that's really frustrating about Gone with the Wind to me, as someone who has read the book twice now and watched the movie, is how deeply unconcerned the story is with slavery. It's just drama. It's a drama. It's just a great backdrop for the story because it has to tie in with Mitchell's own history. It just makes me deeply uncomfortable. It cares about Scarlett O'Hara and her girl boss glow up post the war ending, which is fine with me because I care as much about that as Ashley Wilkins cares for Scarlett. And as much as how Rhett cares for Scarlett at the end of the movie.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Well, she certainly seemed to dabble in some from white supremacist culture. The writer who inspired a lot of Margaret Mitchell's work and that she read frequently as a teenager was a self-proclaimed professional racist author, Thomas Dixon Jr. Dixon Jr. was responsible for a lot of books, but two particularly important best-selling novels. The Leopard's Spots, a romance of the white man's burden. Gag me. And most famously, The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. It supported white supremacy and endorsed the lost cause of the Confederacy ideology and opposed equal rights for blacks. And most importantly, it glorified the Ku Klux Klan as heroic vigilantes. This book would be turned into a movie as the racist film that everyone still has to watch in film school, The Birth of a Nation. Yeah, that was her Harry Potter. And that book is what inspired the 20th century rebirth of the Klan and is probably one of the most horrifying films to ever be made in terms of its political impact. Now, you could see how that would be concerning for her to have loved those. In a letter to Dixon dated August 10th, 1936, Mitchell wrote, "I was practically raised on your books, and I love them very much." Now I know that we have all grown up and found out that people that we liked as children were bad racists, but we disown them. We're all doing that with Harry Potter right now. Like, you know, if we could do it with Orson Scott Card and J.K. Rowling, she could have done so with this Dixon Jr., but that's who she fucked with. As a journalist at the Atlanta Journal, she wrote a series of short sketches about 4 notable Georgian women. The first one was the first woman to ever serve in the United States Senate, Miss Rebecca Latimer Fenton. Fenton was a suffragist, so yay, and a former slaveholder, so nay. And she actively advocated for the lynching of black men in order to protect white women from their lust. If it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravaging human beast, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. There were other non-racist, overtly racist women there, and one woman who was half Yamakra Native American, so, you know, a half star for effort, I fucking suppose. But at the end, you can't really beat the woman who said, let's lynch 1,000 black people a day to protect white women's virginity from the animalistic lust of black men.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
Now, on the flip side, researchers found out in the 1990s that Mitchell secretly donated money to the historically black Morehouse College in Atlanta. She delivered the checks by courier so that no one would know that she was doing it, but there are records of her making these payments to the school. The college's archivist, Herman Skip Mason, said that he would have liked to ask Mitchell, what do you really think about African Americans? I mean, just your honest feelings, you know. Atlanta historian Ira Jo Johns speculates that the author took an interest in healthcare for black people when hospitals denied her own cancer-ridden maid help. So what does it mean that she was raised and inspired by deeply racist segregationists, wrote a book that glamorized the Confederacy and antebellum history, and also gave money to a historically black college for years, potentially because she felt empathy for her black maid who was sick, and it sparked some sort of consciousness in her awakening in her mind? I don't know. I do know that Strom Thurmond was a pro-segregationist Dixiecrat, whatever, I don't care, I don't respect it, who had a hidden black daughter. after he impregnated a 15 or 16-year-old black teenager who was working at his house as a maid when he was 22 years old. He paid for her education at a historically black college and took care of her financial needs throughout her entire life, but didn't acknowledge or claim her openly until he was dead, because it would ruin his reputation. And that when this daughter did come out and say, hey, it's me, everyone was like, oh yeah, we know. Racism comes in many flavors, ladies and gentlemen. And just because you happen to be a fan of one black person, like a Kanye West, a Kendrick Lamar, a Kerry Washington, whatever flavor of black you've chosen, that's one person. Your black best friend is not a definition of how much you love black people, period. Y'all can debate Miss Peggy Mitchell's place on the Susan B. Anthony scale of white feminist progressive racism, but I am personally gonna put her squarely in the I don't think black people shouldn't have rights, but do they need so many pile. As far as I can see from her book and her letters and everything, her opinions about black folk just seem paternalistic and uneducated. In one of her letters, Mitchell even says that despite Scarlett's faults, she remained admirable because, quote, she loved her Negroes and looked after them.
Electric chair.
I don't think any conversation about Gone with the Wind would be complete without addressing its tether. Excuse me, this is a heavy one. Uncle Tom's Cabin. And yes, I have the annotated edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wow, a tale of two beige book covers. Unlike Margaret Mitchell, we know for a fact that Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist. And I think in today's world, we really don't get how hated and dangerous it was to openly be an abolitionist. They were hated even by people who thought slavery was mostly kind of bad because they were seen as way too radical because, okay, you want to free them, but you think that they should have equal rights and marry white people and like have reparations? Too much. The thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin, much like Gone with the Wind, is that it is just not written for black people. It's an abolitionist text. So the motivation of it was to move white audiences by depicting the plight of these tragic black people, which is why all of them are so, for the lack of a better word, basic in terms of their morality and their complexity. It also really leans on Christianity because Stowe was very religious, and Christian ideals of morality are the reason why Tom is just so good and so kind, because he's basically a black Jesus. The catch-22 of Uncle Tom's Cabin, popularity, lack of authenticity, and broad use of stereotypes combine together to create a lot of tropes that have ended up being harmful to black Americans and black people in general because of the output of American culture, especially when stage performances of the book happened and were so popular. All of these caricatures done in blackface that eventually became the beginnings of minstrelsy. In the introduction to my giant annotated Uncle Tom's Cabin by Henry Louis Gage Jr., he states that Uncle Tom became for us the most reviled figure in American literary history. He was the embodiment of race betrayal and an object of scorn, a scapegoat for all of our political self-doubts. We talked about him as the model to be avoided. I doubt whether anyone who tossed that epithet around during those years had actually reread Stowe's novel. James Baldwin, shout out to him, famously called it a very bad novel and self-righteous, virtuous sentimentality. And I don't disagree with that. I mean, Baldwin is not wrong. But I also think it is very easy to snatch Uncle Tom's Cabin away from its historical context and go, this is an inauthentic piece of shit. Because Uncle Tom's Cabin isn't for black people. When I say it isn't for black people, I don't mean black people can't like it or get it or get anything out of it. What I mean is that it was specifically written intentionally to appeal to white audiences, to galvanize them against slavery. Part of the reason why slave narratives like Frederick Douglass's, William Wells Brown's, and others were so important was that it humanized these stories and passed them along to white audiences who maybe had no idea what slavery is about. You don't need to tell enslaved black folk what slavery is about. They get the deal. These were written and put to page to show the world, the white world, what the slave trade had done to people. So while today we read them as African American literature and as black folk to gain perspective about our enslaved ancestors or enslaved kin, at the time, many of these stories were written for white audiences. And that led to sometimes these very overdramatic, sentimental stories. Especially stories that appeal to domesticity, because that was a very big element of the way that this period was framed. The cult of domesticity will come up in another video about girlhood. What I will say we can say about Uncle Tom's Cabin is that there had been plenty of black written narratives that had come out depicting slavery. Why this is the one they chose to get attached to? Wouldn't have been my first choice, but it was a genre, it is an element of its time, and I feel for historic purposes of understanding the literature of what led to the Civil War, it is an important book. Problematic, should always be read in a sense of that academic purpose. And that is really important, because for me, what separates Uncle Tom's Cabin from Gone with the Wind is ultimately one was pretty much pushed out of general reading circles because it offended black people so much in terms of its stereotyping and its legacy because of that stereotyping, and the other is an ingrained part of our pulp culture. I remember an episode of The Vampire Diaries where there was a Gone with the Wind themed party that Caroline was super excited about.
Now we're going to take a page from Scarlet. We made it through the war. Now you guys went through hell, and my mom knows I am a vampire. So basically, it's like Lana has burned. And yet, in spite of everything, we persevere.
With no commentary. True Blood had Tara say that she was named after a plantation, a reference I did not get at the time because I had not seen Gone with the Wind, and when I finally saw it I was like, oh, Tara. What? Gone with the Wind represents a problematic nostalgia for the antebellum South. Regardless of what Mitchell says, intended, all of that. It has enough trappings of girl boss with Scarlet and romance, I guess, that is popular enough to make people feel possessive and safe and adoring about it. Even when I hear people call Scarlett O'Hara a proto-feminist character, it really boggles the mind, in my opinion, because she is exactly the type of toxic girl boss white woman that we are talking about now. You know, this capitalist CEO positions himself as like a powerful figure, but brings up no women with her. You know, Scarlett's a terrible toxic person, which makes her an interesting character, but even so, not that unique. Becky Sharp been doing it for a minute, ladies and gentlemen. Like, if you want to see that same narrative, you can read, you know, Forever Amber. It's the same book. It's about as long, and it is just drama after drama. When it was taken down, the movie from HBO Max, a take that was temporary instead to be, it became a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And it's like, why? Why are you so possessive over a 4-hour-long movie based on a 1,000+ page book that you have probably never read?
I did grow up watching Gone with the Wind, and I do view it a little differently, but
because it allows people to believe that there is a separation between antebellum the vibe and historical antebellum slavery. That's why Deadpool and Serena van der Woodsen can get married on a plantation and not think about it. And many people actually get married on plantations. I don't know why y'all do that. That shit is fucked up. That's why people can consider Scarlett a feminist icon. What? Even though she literally makes her money from abusing the disenfranchised.
All I ask is that you keep the mill running and deliver my lumber when I want it.
Johnny Gallagher's your man, miss. But remember, no questions and no interference.
That's a bar.
That's why people will tote around Mammy's sassy black womanness as a sign of progressivism and not propaganda. Mammy is a character that's supposed to make you think slavery wasn't that bad, because look at how she just whips all these white people into shape. She's still a slave. You don't see her with her own children, which you know she had to have because it was slavery. It was slavery, not band camp. Gone with the Wind is built for you to enjoy the thrills of antebellum and Reconstruction era romance and admire this girl boss whatever without feeling any guilt. Because the people who were the most at risk during that time are in the margins of the novel. They have no purpose, and at the end of it, as far as Gone with the Wind is concerned, Black lives absolutely do not matter.
It's definitely a no for me, dog.
I'm gonna end this video with two interesting things I found during my research, because honestly, the best part of making this video was finding out all these little pieces of information. So, in Nazi Germany, as we start this off, in Nazi Germany, literature was a really important manipulation tool. So there were a lot of book burnings and banned authors who were seen as subversive, right? However, there were still popular romance novels, quote unquote, that while they were seen as sort of like rubbish novels, did very well. The most popular of these novels was Gone with the Wind. Many Nazi reviewers praised the Old South's defense of social hierarchy and slavery and enjoyed the antebellum South as a, quote, a wonderful, strictly regulated life. Hitler also loved the film version but had to ban it from public viewing after the war because America and anti-Semitism. So, you know, as much as he enjoyed it, he could not ignore that it had been made by Jewish people. And Hitler also saw the defeat of the South as representing the end of America's chance for historical greatness. So, take of that what you will. And in a less Nazi tone, in 2001, The Wind Done Gone, a parody reinterpretation of the novel written by African-American author and songwriter Alice Randall, was released. The story focuses on a mulatto slave girl named Sinara, who is the daughter of Scarlett's father and Mammy. The estate of Margaret Mitchell sued Randall and the publishing company for the book, which was Houghton Mifflin. The case attracted so much attention from leading scholars, authors, and even Toni Morrison herself weighed in on the issue. The case was settled in 2002 when Houghton Mifflin agreed to make an unspecified donation to Morehouse College in exchange for Mitchell's estate dropping the litigation. First of all, score one for fan fiction, and also she really liked Morehouse College, I guess? When it comes to it, the reason I made this video before anything about Gone with the Wind really came into the public consciousness for like the 15th millionth time was just how it frustrated me to constantly see Scarlett O'Hara touted as this feminist icon. First of all, the best female character in the book is Melanie Wilkins, whatever. Debate me. Every black person who has been told that they should maybe check out Gone with the Wind, or that maybe it's not racist. It is. So do black people need to read Gone with the Wind? Black people don't need to do anything for anybody but live their best goddamn lives. That's that on that. But as a novel, you know, you could get other ones, you know? If you're gonna read a book about a hateful, vindictive white woman, I feel like we have better options. I feel like we have enough representation of that we don't need to just settle for Scarlett O'Hara. You know what I mean? Like, I would say read Vanity Fair, Becky Sharp, shout out to her. That would be my terrible white woman of choice. And if you don't want to watch a 4-hour film and want the same sort of like slavery backdrop, Jezebel starring Buddy Davis. It's actually quite good. I mean, it's still racist, but it's not 4 hours long.
Saucy, isn't it? And vulgar. Yes, isn't it?
So yeah, Gone with the Wind is kind of trash, and you don't need it, and don't tell black people to read it, and if you love the movie so much, that's fine, but putting a little bit of historical context about why it's kind of trash is fine. And if you didn't realize that it was kind of trash, then maybe you should open a goddamn history book. Good night.
Well, shall we go, Pris?
Not till you're properly dressed.
You're sure it's the dress? It couldn't be that you're afraid. Afraid somebody will insult me and you'll find it necessary to defend me.
Yeah? Ready, Annabelle?
Pris, please.
We're ready, my boy.